morning, everyone. My name's Jo Glanville. I'm Director of English Pen, and it's a very great pleasure to open you to the London Book Fair, to the English Pen Literary Salon. This is the first of many events that we're going to be having through the course of the book fair. So I very much hope that you'll not only stay for this event, but come back for more. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Josh Cohen, who is the author of a fascinating book called The Private Life: Why We Remain in the Dark. Josh is Professor of Modern Literary Theory at Goldsmiths. He's a psychoanalyst, and his books include How to Read Freud. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that privacy has become one of the issues of the day, partly because of the way in which we also very freely share information on social media, partly through the extent to which we know that other people have access to our information, whether that's private companies or the intelligence services, as was revealed by Edward Snowden a couple of years ago. Now, Josh Cohen's book is a very, very original take on the subject because he brings the approach of a psychoanalyst to the subject, and he really attempts to understand our relationship to privacy in a very new way. So I wanted to ask you first, Josh, why you were attracted to the subject.
I think that the initial interest was actually deeply personal. It was triggered by the sudden eruption of various privacy-related stories, mostly actually related more at the time to tabloid intrusion. The story that I think really triggered something, not just in my mind but in my gut, was the Millie Dowler story. The hacking, and the fact that we then discovered that she might have been hacked.
So Millie Dowler was the girl who was murdered,
yeah.
And it was then revealed that the News of the World had hacked her phone.
Exactly, yeah. And one of the questions that got me thinking at the time, very casually, was why is it that the sense of public scandal around the violation of another person's mind, another person's private space, should become so explosive when it concerns somebody who was dead, who, after all, couldn't be harmed in any kind of palpable sense by it. And yet there was this sense that this was a much deeper, more profound, more kind of ineffable violation of private space. And it got me to thinking about, well, how do our notions of privacy circulate? What do we really mean by privacy? Because in some ways, I think we have a very kind of workaday and almost impoverished sense of what it is, of what privacy is now. We tend to think it's what happens behind closed doors, what happens in our bedrooms, or what happens in our bank accounts, sort of the things that we do that we don't want other people to know about, we don't want other people to see. Now, obviously, that's a dimension of it, but our private life is a lot more than that. It's not just something that happens in a confined space. In a way, it's something, privacy is something we carry around with us. Any moment, like now, when we're turned towards the world and people are looking at us and listening to us and making out what we're saying to them, there's also something going on that, of course, they can't access. And I suppose one of the key points of the book is that it's also something we can't access. And I'm wondering what I got interested in what happens to us, not only when we're intruded upon in this kind of very externalized way, when our data is stolen, when our everyday movements are tracked and surveyed, but what is happening to the inner life? What is the effect of the inner life, of the imagination, on emotional life, of a culture of permanent visibility?
Now, you say in your book that there is a war on privacy. So there's a sense in which your book is really addressing what you seem to see as a crisis for our society. You talk about there being a culture of intrusion. Your book opens with a description of the way in which someone so publicly is revealing their private life through a public conversation. Why do you think there is a war on privacy now? What is it that's happening now that is making this critical?
I think that we are at the threshold of a kind of a technological revolution that is making it possible for us to share everything indiscriminately, to permanently broadcast our lives. And I don't want to be moralizing about that, because it is a massive temptation. It's fascinating, and no doubt it's very exciting to imagine that the things that belonged in the confines of a small space of not just sort of physical space, but also a small circle of other people, suddenly, you know, there's a kind of infinite expanse of the world with which you can share the details of your life. I think that one of the consequences of that revolution is that there is a kind of a loss of much sense of what gets lost in the transition. And so that's one of the reasons. And the other more kind of specifically psychoanalytic idea that comes across in the book is that we have been given the opportunity, apparently, by various technologies to know everything about other people. And I think that taps into a kind of voracious desire in us to make everything about others known. And there's also almost a kind of scandal attached to the idea that somebody would hold something back. And
well, yeah, there's the famous privacy is for paedophiles phrase that was made at the Leveson inquiry, wasn't
exactly. And that, of course, was more in the context of tabloid intrusion. That was more in the context of the idea that celebrities, because they are celebrities, are a fair game. But the celebrity, I mean, the book is not that preoccupied with celebrity culture per se, but the celebrities are the paradigm case in a way, because there is this sense that by putting themselves out in the public glare, there is something kind of scandalizing or outrageous about the idea that they would hold something back.
And the same goes, doesn't it, the idea that you've got nothing to fear if you've got nothing to hide, and that feeds into the same idea that we need to be transparent. And you think that's dangerous? I
think it's very dangerous, and one of the reasons I think it's dangerous is if you think about the source of that idea, and I'm kind of wary of using this word, but there's no question that the first political regimes to question the idea that there is a private life that you can hold back for yourself were totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian regimes are terrified of privacy, and for good reason, because privacy is where the unexpected happens. It's where a new idea can come to light. It's where one can think for oneself and not in the name of or subservient to the existing regime, which is why what totalitarian regimes of apparently different political stripes have in common is the concerted, relentless effort to destroy privacy.
And what you've touched on there is something that is a real puzzle to most of us at Penn, because we're part of this campaign following Snowden's revelations to call for reform of the legislation so the intelligence services cannot harvest all our data in the way that we now know that they are. And it's an unprecedented campaign bringing together all the major civil society groups.
Yeah.
But essentially, the public appetite for calling for reform, for backing a campaign, is very, very limited. But what's been exposed is that democracies are carrying on in the ways that we once imagined East Germany did with the Stasi. This has now become the norm.
Yeah.
Why do you think, from your perspective as a psychoanalyst and writer, how do you explain the fact that the public essentially aren't outraged about this?
I think when you invoke the Stasi, people think very much in terms of a model of predator and victim. That the victim of the Stasi surveillance is passive, doesn't really know what's happening to them, and is helpless in the face of a very dangerous and voracious state machine. and they have no autonomy. They have no choice in the matter. What our consumer culture does very well, of course, is that it presents to us these kinds of scenarios as though they were choices, as though we were autonomous. So we get terms and conditions that, of course, none of us read, but nonetheless, we get terms and conditions. So we by ticking a box, we give ourselves the illusion that we've consented to our data being shared, for example. And at every stage, we say to ourselves, when we upload photos of ourselves, when we share personal intimacies, when we collude in various ways with the erosion of privacy, we tell ourselves, well, whether it's good or bad, at least I'm choosing to do it. And that distinguishes me from a victim of the Stasi or the KGB.
But again, it comes back to, in a different way, what you're talking about, which is the essential need to protect a core that is essential for our identity. And Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to a private life, recognises that. And it was written very much with totalitarianism, whether it's communist or fascist, in mind. It's a core human right for a democracy. And it may not be the Stasi, we may not be victims, but we are surrendering, it seems to me.
I think that's right. And I think it's in some ways it's much more insidious, because with the Stasi there's a model where, in a way, the relations of power are much clearer. Here, they're kind of fuzzed by the fact that we think we know what we're doing. We're given the sense that, after all, we're choosing to share. We're choosing to give away our own privacy, and what we give away is up to us. But I think that part of the problem here as well is that the social media in particular really cultivates a kind of a culture of self-externalization. It encourages us to see ourselves in terms of what we show to the world, in terms of the pictures I can take of myself, in terms of the opinions or the self-descriptions that I can give that kind of show me on the surface. And I think that when we think of ourselves as giving ourselves away, that's actually what we're giving away. We're giving away the surface of ourselves. Now, in a way, that means that we can keep something of ourselves back. But I think when we spend so much time cultivating our external selves, when we're checking our phone every 10 minutes to see, how many likes we've had for our latest status update or whatever, the problem is that the attention and the curiosity that we can give to our inner self, to the self that is not visible, I think is drained away.
Yes, but there is the voluntary aspect of that, but there's also the fact that there's a whole aspect of it that isn't voluntary. But the expectation is, particularly I think with the threats of terrorism, the concerns about national security, that it makes it very difficult, I think, for people to argue against the state or the intelligence services needing to have that access.
I think that's right. And I think that, again, that is not just about kind of rational arguments about security. Again, I think it's sold as that, and maybe people buy it as, well, I need to be accessible to the security services, because if I'm not, then very dangerous people aren't either. But I think what's actually happened is not just, this argument is not just happening at a kind of external discursive level. It's not just about public arguments. Something private about ourselves is tapped into when the whole kind of anxiety about security is invoked. Something quite infantile and helpless in us. This sense that if I don't give myself up to the higher power that's protecting me, then I'm sent back to this place of the kind of helpless infant who can't possibly look after themselves and is at the mercy of these very dangerous forces that are crowding in on me.
But one of the core arguments in your book is our ambivalence about this private life, because you very strongly lay out, very clearly lay out, that this is so private that it's private even to us.
Yeah.
And that that's where psychoanalysis can come in to unlock that private life. Yeah. And you argue that essentially we find that intolerable.
I think so. I think we find it intolerable in ourselves, and that's part of our voracious drive to uncover it in other people. So we're fascinated. I mean, one of the things that tabloid culture does for us is it gives us a kind of channel for the impulse to find out the worst about other people. And I think it's a way of deflecting our kind of frightened curiosity about the worst about ourselves. I mean, when I started my own analysis as part of training, one of the first things my analyst said to me that really got under my skin and really kind of changed things for me was when he said, "You see, you're not quite so nice a guy as you think you are." And this is, I think, the aspect of ourselves that, in a way, it's a relief to be deflected away from, not to have to think about too much. If I'm thinking about who I present myself to be to the world, then I don't have to think too much about what's going on within. And that's not always the most attractive prospect.
I mean, in your book, one of the very enjoyable aspects of it is the way that you bring parts of your private life, parts of your own story into the book. And one of the most striking passages is when you describe as a young child, coming across this book about the Holocaust and seeing these truly horrific images of what happens. And you describe how you had to send the images somewhere too private for me to reach.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to reveal something of yourself in that way in the book?
I felt that the book would really lose something of the force it could have if I didn't think about myself as somebody who had a private life, if I didn't use the most obvious and available case. When Freud was developing the whole apparatus, clinical, theoretical, of psychoanalysis, one of the most interesting aspects of it is that he only had one subject to work on, and that was himself. So, Freud's first patient really was himself. He just immersed himself exhaustively in his own dreams and his own feelings, the worst feelings. I mean, the first dream that he reports in the interpretation of dreams is fascinating because he emerges as such, at an unconscious level, he emerges as such a shabby person. And yet it's for me, it's such a heroic thing to do. Now, in that passage, I'm just a kid. But I also talk about, I'm not just talking about feeling very traumatized and upset by the images. There is that. But there is also something about the ruthlessness of the self that's revealed in that passage. What I actually did was shut the book, pretend it hadn't happened, and carried on as normal.
Why is that ruthless?
Because I think that there's something about our own self-protectiveness. And, I think in the context of Penn, it's very interesting because it says a lot about why it's hard to get people involved in campaigns. We use these hideous terms like compassion fatigue, but there is something. It's not just fatigue. It's a kind of very primitive defense mechanism that I think kicks in and says, look, if I allow this to penetrate me, to insinuate itself, these images, these stories, these various kind of tales of horror to really kind of insinuate themselves into me, I won't be able to continue. And I think that kind of absolutely ruthless shutting of the book for me was a very kind of canny self-protective measure.
But what you're saying is that by doing that, you're also banishing that experience into an inaccessible part of yourself, which makes trouble, probably.
Yeah, it does make trouble for you, yeah. I think that's right. I think that one of the reasons that we find it so difficult to look at the mass suffering of other people around the world that we're so aware is happening is because it shames us. And I think shame is one of the most difficult emotions to live with. And the more we're aware of it, the more we're overwhelmed by shame, by a sense of helplessness, by a sense of our sheer inadequacy. And of course the answer to that is to use your inadequacy, to actually mobilize your feeling of inadequacy to do whatever it is you can. But I actually think that there's a certain courage that can be very difficult to marshal from inside you.
Interesting. I'd like to give all of you a chance to ask questions, and there are microphones, so if you would like to ask a question, do hold on for the microphone to reach you. Anybody like to ask a question? No? No questions? So I'm going to carry on then. Stick your hand up if you do change your mind and would like to ask a question. One of the big changes for us at Penn has been that, you know, Penn traditionally supports freedom of expression.
Yeah. And
privacy was often something that would be a problem for freedom of expression. Where, say, somebody sort of said, my privacy is being invaded, therefore you can't, you know, publish that picture, you can't publish that article. But now with the internet, that has to a degree changed, so that you can't fully enjoy the right to freedom of expression if your privacy isn't protected as well, which brings in other issues. And since the Leveson inquiry, since the huge outcry over the behaviour of the tabloids, and obviously the News of the World was the trigger for the Leveson inquiry, was the trigger for you for your book. And there have been calls, and there is on the table a Royal Charter that will introduce a whole new level of control on the press. And I'm wondering what you think about that tension, that if some of those measures come in, it may be much, much harder for the press to cover the stories that may need to be covered.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult dilemma. Maybe I can sort of slightly displace the question, because there's something kind of that evokes this for me in the world of psychoanalysis. One of the things that you experience in the consulting room, which is very strange, but it happens again and again and again. You tell people at the outset that they should say whatever comes to mind and feel free to tell you whatever they want. And at some point, it will almost always come back to you as the client saying something like, I know I have to tell you everything, or I feel very bad that I haven't told you this because I know I'm supposed to tell you everything, or even, I don't really want to tell you this, but I know that I have to. Now, what's interesting is that you're getting a completely distorted version of the message that you gave, which is that they should feel free to say whatever they want, which means that they should also feel free not to say whatever they don't want to say. And I think that there is something about that confusion that speaks to the situation that we're talking about between, you know, the tension between privacy and freedom of speech. Because freedom of speech has to include the right to hold things back. It doesn't mean that everything that is said, everything that is thought is just a big available soup of data that we can fish out to whatever degree we want. And I think that there is something about us that colludes a kind of inner coercive, you know, an inner totalitarian that always likes to imagine that, you know, that feels very guilty and feels that we have to give whatever is demanded of us. And so,
in a situation of psychotherapy?
In psychotherapy, but also I think something similar happens with our data, you know, in the online world. We feel that, you know, if we're not being transparent, if we're not making ourselves, we must have something to hide if we've something to fear, kind of thing. So we hand ourselves over, I think, too freely.
And do you think that this whole desire to expose ourselves to a degree, whether it's live logging, is part of that?
I think it is part of that. I think that if you know Dave Eggers' book, The Circle, he taps into that dimension of it very nicely. You know, that actually it's a book about a massive corporation, kind of hybrid of Google, Apple, Microsoft, that ends up taking over the world, really, taking over people's external and inner lives so that they can no longer function without it. And one of the things that I think he gets very nicely is that people share not only out of a kind of gratuitous exhibitionist tendency, but out of fear, out of the fear that they would be seen to be holding something back.
Yeah.
And in that novel, it's kind of reproached as selfish.
Yes. Do you use social media? Do you tweet?
I don't.
And is that for the reasons that you've?
I'd like to to get big myself up with a sense of the dignity and the nobility of opting out. I don't know that it has that much to do with that. I think it probably has more to do with something that I'm aware. I mean, this book is kind of written out of an intense awareness of the excitement of being able to share anything at any time. And I think that I'm actually not that good at voluntarily keeping things under control. So I suspect that if I were on Twitter, I would find it very difficult to get off the bloody thing. So
self-censorship because you might let too much out.
Yeah, or I just might waste too much time.
So what would you like the impact of your book to be? Because it's a highly original take on a subject, an approach I think that really hasn't been made before. What would you ideally like to see the impact?
I think what I'd really like is to get people thinking about their privacy in a more expansive way, for them to see that what is under threat when their privacy is attacked is not just the dry matter of their data or specific kind of circumscribed spaces in their life, but actually it's their inner life, and even more important word than inner life, I think it's their imagination that is under threat. That the assault on privacy is an assault on imaginative and creative life. That without privacy we can't have an imaginative and creative life. And so that's why, in a way, I think there is a kind of natural affinity between privacy and the fight for privacy and the fight for literature.
But would you expect, say, if somebody really took your message to heart, would you expect them to change the way they engage with social media? Would you expect it to percolate through to that area of their lives?
I am less interested in behavioral changes than in just getting people to think, question, doubt more. In a way, denaturalizing the way that they would use social media, so that rather than that kind of automatic default mode tweeting, they might, if after reading my book they paused for a moment and said, well, why am I about to do this? What is it that makes me want to share this? What is it that makes me want to say this at this point? Not because they're condemning what they're saying or not because they're moralizing about it, but simply what's going on, what's happening. I think a curiosity about their own motives in their relationship to their own privacy. That's really what I would like the book to give people.
Josh, thank you very much. Josh will be signing copies of his book, The Private Life, at the Foyles Bookshop just over there. Do buy it. It is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.